Oh well. I can try making it go. Anyways, I screwed up. Didn't get the intro going this week. I apologize, guys. Welcome to the Growing with Fishes podcast, episode 231. This week we have Mathew Gates with us. How's it going, Mia?
Going pretty good, I'd have to say. I know that I'm filling in for another client or another person right now, but I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, man. Thanks for coming on and sharing your knowledge. You're definitely one of the best sources of insect knowledge out there. Uh, for those of you guys that don't know, he has a great YouTube channel called Zenthanol. I'll let you pronounce your Instagram so I get it right. I'll
Oh
make
yeah,
sure it's in the description here.
no problem. Yeah, so I have the YouTube channel, a science communication channel about integrated pest management called Zenthanol on YouTube. I'll also be using it in the chat here too as well. So you can tag me using Zenthanol, Zenthanol. And then on Instagram, I post a lot of my other content, and that's called Sync Angel. Sync like synchronize, and angel like angel. Synchangel. And I've posted a ton of my content on Instagram. Those are like the two major places. You can also find me at Sync Angel on Twitter as well.
So you do a lot of you've been doing a lot of cool new content on your channel lately. You have been doing a lot of really cool observational videos. So tell us a bit about that, because I've been finding those really interesting.
Well, I'm actually really glad to hear that. And a lot of people have been saying that lately. I feel like I've been getting a little bit more engagement, at least on those kinds of videos, which is great for me for a couple of reasons. The first one is that observational footage that I put out there is kind of inspired by the lack of it being there in the first place. I'm sort of surprised to some degree that there isn't more people who are doing this kind of thing, simply just posting this stuff. I see it sometimes on Instagram, especially when people are like, hey, what's this bug in my plant? Is it a problem? Which 99% of the time people presume to be, which oftentimes it isn't. The two biggest things I get asked about, in fact, are predatory mites in the soil, as well as on the leaves sometimes, and springtails in the substrate, especially when there's a ton of them and they get you're irrigating and they sort of rise up to the surface because they're buoyant. So those things aren't really a problem, but because they're sort of weird insect-looking things, people freak out, understandably. And so if I'm able to keep people from panicking about things that aren't not a huge issue in the first place, then people don't spend money unnecessarily. They don't destroy their plants unnecessarily. I've seen that happen a lot. So I'm just happy to be able to put out information where people can simply, like in a video, like on YouTube, they can, I can forward them a video or somebody else can. They can say, hey, you think you have rice root aphids? Well, actually, you have fungus gnats. Here's a fungus gnat versus a rice root aphid that people very often confuse. And then also other sorts of things like just behavioral things like interactions between biocontrol agents and predators and pests and that sort of a thing. Because ultimately, if you have that footage that you can take a look at, you can kind of become more familiar with sort of the small little idiosyncrasies. And I think that's kind of the devil in the detail knowledge that a lot of people just don't have access to. Even research reports are simply like static images almost all the time.
Yeah, and especially when you're looking at it's one of the things I love to point out when we're teaching about mites. When you're trying to identify an unknown mite species, it's definitely something that stands out with the predatory mites. They have those those feeder arms out. They're reaching around. They're looking for something to attack. Whereas the spider mites and other things like that they're not as skitsy with those longer feeder legs. And there's a lot that you can gain for observations for with the videos compared to the pictures, just like you're talking about. But especially with the mites and trying to ID unknown ones, I think it's definitely one of the key things to look for.
I definitely agree with that. Yeah, like and like you say, like that's the way that I usually interpret it for people. And I think it's a really helpful, quick and dirty rule of the thumb, where people can, reference those that footage and go, oh, okay, predatory mites are fast, like you're describing usually. And if they were herbivorous, they'd probably be feeding on the plant since they're on the plant. But since they're not doing that, sort of your intuition can kind of tell you that by having this sort of like, heuristic. But, there's always caveats, right? And counterexamples. I like to tell people that although the predator being fast and mobile and the pest being like slow or sessile or in big aggregations can be usually true in a lot of cases, there are, of course, examples like praying mantises and other ambush predators like predatory true bugs and assassin bugs like that and that kind of a thing. And even have situations where maybe a group of insects that all kind of look the same, like for example the pentantamidae, the shield bugs. Those will have some predatory species and mostly herbivorous species, but it can be hard to tell the difference. And usually doesn't make or break the situation, but for people who are trying to use, especially like native predators, it can be helpful to have these sort of niche examples.
That especially too, and just learning the different mouth parts that you can kind of look for universally as well, especially when you're looking at some of the different assassin bug species. I know here in Oklahoma we have the giant wheel bugs that will definitely hurt you pretty
Yeah,
good if you pick
yeah,
them up, but they are definitely in the field they're very skittish. They would much rather walk away from your hand. You can be actively pruning the plant and they'll kind of work their way away from you while you're pruning that plant. They're not an aggressive insect, and a lot of the stuff that people are really afraid of in the garden, widow spiders would be another one that are extremely shy. Yes, they are capable of really hurting you, but they aren't aggressive at all. And I think that there's a lot of stuff that people are kind of afraid of that they really, if they leave them in the garden, they'll have a lot fewer problems, even if they are a bit scary to look at.
right. I definitely agree with that. I want to echo that sentiment that like there are a lot of things. Luckily, in like North America, generally, the amount of like medically significant for most people, anyways, like spiders and other insects, you can usually kind of count on one hand or two hands, maybe that are going to be really problematic. But you're right, like black widows, and here in Southern California in particular, I remember when I was much younger in the early 2000s, I remember reading an article about how the brown widow population was actually displacing the black widow population, primarily because the weather was even more warm than usual, and that just sort of like there was no there wouldn't be like the mild winters or like even like more severe winters that can sometimes happen. Since that hasn't happened for a long time, the populations just kind of annually get larger without having that kind of like stopping point, that overwintering and sort of torpor inducing period. So that kind of benefited them. And ironically, the brown widows are actually more, they have a more potent venom, but they administer less of it, at least against humans. And so they're more venomous, but they're actually less dangerous. So it actually works out for us. At
So
least that's what I read a long time ago. Maybe this is old information. I want to say that first, but that's my understanding.
so that's a great topic. With this huge cold snap that happened all the way deep into Texas and actually provided some of the coldest temperatures that a lot of these areas have had in quite a long time. Can we expect fewer insects this year, or at the very least earlier on in the spring, kind of maybe a little less insect pressure, or is that something that maybe is a little hopeful thinking?
If you've experienced a pretty severe winter, I would say that you're probably doing well. I'm sure there are native organisms that are used to overwintering in that particular environment, wherever that might be, just speaking generally. But I do feel like, temperate climates are it's a very, very broad sort of spectrum. So you got people like me who actually live in like a subtropical environment, but like for those of us who actually get a seasonal winter that's significant, I would say that you probably have less of a problem. And that allows you to kind of restart. And it's something that I think a lot of people could take to heart. Continuous growth in cannabis cultivation in particular is something that can be sometimes hard to do in some locations, at least, compared to other locations and other systems and situations. So when you do have those winters, you can actually sort of reset, you can repair or shore up your defenses, points of ingress, put out a mesh net or something like this, or some sort of physical barrier, or apply or get rid of weeds and other sorts of plants that the overwintering populations might be using as um, cover, to hibernate essentially. And if you can do that, or you can also destroy things that are in the ground potentially too. But you got to be careful with that because you can also disrupt other problems or other things that you don't want to disrupt in the soil generally.
So you do a lot of really cool videos and cover a lot of topics other people don't do a lot of. I guess we'll just start off. One of the more recent ones you did was you did a ton of footage on the rice root aphids. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And because you got a lot of really good footage there.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a reason for that. The most recent video that I have out here is about, on my YouTube channel, anyways, is about rice root aphids and their sort of spring swarming that they're doing right now in Southern California. I didn't really articulate it very specifically in the video. Maybe I should have. But one of the inspirations for that video is the fact that, year after year, I have a pest primer, a hashtag pest primer video on the rice root aphid that I made in 2018. And it's kind of my standard sort of video that I give people if they have never dealt with rice root aphid or if they need a sort of a refresher on what are its hosts, what are its reproductive potentials, what are some of its treatments and things like this. But I've noticed that, at least in Western North America, um, basically the rice root aphid populations like to kind of swarm or kind of create the winged forms that colonize new plants around the springtime. And I don't know how much that has to do with especially in cannabis anyways. Senescing has a factor with most aphid winged morph development, as well as changes in temperature and light levels, just kind of like with plants, right? Because they have to follow the host. But for rice root aphid in particular, they have a specific lifestyle called holocyclic, which means that they alternate between a primary woody host in the autumn and winter and a spring summer host, secondary spring summer host that is herbaceous, or usually anyways. And I'm not quite sure which one cannabis would technically fall under, if I'm being completely honest. But when it's in places outside of its native range, which would be Eastern Asia, like Japan, the rice root aphid only produces by parthenogenesis. It only produces clonal offspring, like a lot of aphids are known to do. In its native territory, it does produce eggs to overwinter. So even here in Southern California, where they don't really get huge winter problems in most of the places, where the adults can even overwinter, or they can just simply live out their lives in greenhouses and outside under human cultivation care, I do still feel like there is a seasonal kind of lifestyle occurrence or behavioral change. And I was trying to document that in the video, and I thought I did a pretty good job because although the rice root aphids were in this area for a while, for several weeks, the sort of winged morph population was low or non-existent, and then suddenly kind of around the beginning of March, end of February, I saw this sort of uptick, not only in this location but multiple others. So it kind of corroborated.
Yeah, it's definitely. There's something I researched last year when I ran into someone that had them out here in Oklahoma, and then found out that there's actually a bunch of different, aquatic aphids. There's even a lily aphid that it is very similar looking to the rice root aphids, and I got a bunch of great pictures of them. But there's definitely ones that I've found, in the ponds and retention ponds outside, the facilities that were the same ones that we were finding inside. And they probably just flew in, just like you're saying, when they were in that flight form. Now in the inside and indoors, I've mostly seen the flight form when they're in pretty high numbers. You don't usually see
Mm.
as many of them until they're in those higher population numbers. But once you start seeing a ton of nymphs and a ton of the non-winged adults, it's only a matter of time before they start flying around.
I was totally remiss. You touched on one of the important other sort of factors. Not only is the change of the host physiology important, as well as light levels and temperature, aggregation is, and also I mentioned that in the video, but aggregation is another really important facet of that. So definitely, even if it's not quite the right conditions in other cases, the colony aggregation can sort of that seem to have an effect. And a lot of insects, and technically really swarming is usually reserved for other sorts of behaviors, if I'm being really pedantic. But like we see this in locusts too, where aggregation seems to have a response that changes the behavior significantly. It's kind of, there's this concept called stigmergy, or stigmergy. I don't know exactly how people like to pronounce it, but essentially it's this idea that sort of, it's like emergent properties. Like you wouldn't be able to figure it out from a droplet of water how a tsunami works, but if you put a bunch of droplets of water together with other conditions, you get tsunamis. In similar ways, like insects will have like weird situations where if the context is right, if the environment's right, and there's a bunch of them together, hormones and seemingly also like visual cues will change their behavior significantly. So they'll go from being, in the locust case, an individual feeders to group feeders, and then reproduce kind of in tandem.
Awesome. So you also do a ton of work on different viruses. A whole lot of people actually cover or touch on the different cannabis viruses. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, because you have some of the best content out there on quite a few of the different topics in that realm.
I appreciate that. Yeah, so it's a topic that I feel doesn't get a whole lot of credit. I think that we're going to see a lot more of it recently, though. So I'm kind of excited to see people who are plant virologists and other folks to actually do research, and especially on cannabis specifically, and things like transmission rates and what insects actually transmit viruses, and maybe what are some things that we haven't even documented yet that we can kind of test for and see. In addition to that, there's also phytoplasmas that are special kinds of bacteria that infect various plants. And unfortunately, cannabis is a host of a couple of different groups, apparently. But to start with the viruses and viroids, we, of course, many people know the hop latent viroid, which is more common in hops, of course. Humulus and cannabis diverged about, depending on the molecular clock estimate you go with, about 19 or so million years ago to maybe like, somewhere in the 20s, millions of years ago. And that means that they're very related. And there's a few different pests that are also kind of in that situation. The hop latent viroid is thought to have possibly been, or I'm sorry, I'm not, the hop latent viroid is not what I was thinking of there. That was the cannabis cryptic virus, which I will go over. But the hop latent viroid, of course, kind of makes sense because of this relativeness between hops and cannabis being so close in the Cannabaceae. There's some controversy about whether or not, and I don't actually know the answer to this, it can transmit through various ways. Like wounds are probably a transmission. In fact, it's the main way that it is transmitted, I should say. I meant like wounds that are like open, that aren't like cut, through like mechanical or physical touching. That's kind of what I was referring to. But the main way that hop latent viroid is transmitted is through cuttings that are passed when you use like a blade, like scissors or pruners or something like this. That's the main way. And the latent in its name kind of means that you don't necessarily see the symptoms of colonization until maybe many days or weeks later, which makes it incredibly difficult and confusing to deal with. And when, nurseries and other groups, even residential growers, if they contract it in their plants and then they don't see any apparent problem, even if they are highly biosecure vigilant, they won't know because nobody, you don't know to check your plants regularly. It's an expensive process and all those sorts of things. And you can't really check without laboratory help. Anyways, it can become a real problem and can affect many kinds of plants. And indeed, we saw that happen in this decade. And so hopefully next decade, we'll have a lot more procedures against that. Yeah, that's a hot latent viroid itself. I did mention the cannabis cryptic virus, which unlike the latent viroid does not actually have symptoms at all. That's what the cryptic means in its name. And that one is considered to potentially have been, if we're right about the lineage, it might have actually originally been a fungal pathogen a very long period of time ago. It might have been transmitted through a pathogen that infected an ancestor of cannabis. We don't know how long ago. And kind of got stuck because it only really replicates intracellularly, and so when the cells split, the virus goes with it. It doesn't like try to colonize outside or anything like that, like a lot of viruses do, and seemingly it's harmless. I have a video about that too, and I'd like to do a follow-up on it, but again, there's not a whole lot of research on it. There are also two other viruses that are really important that I'd like people to know about. The first one is the beet curlytop virus, which is a super common virus in agriculture. It's globally there. There's tons of different strains, and it's got this nasty habit that it shares with the other virus that infects cannabis, the sclerosis virus, with what's called recombination or pseudo recombination. And what that means is that the various strains can sometimes co-infect a plant, and then they kind of co-mingle, and some of the best parts and worst parts get combined, and you start to get like replications of new strains that might have a bunch of fitness benefits because of it. We already know that the Warland strain of beet curlytop virus has been detected in Arizona, I believe, in Yuma and Graham counties. But it's also been in Colorado since maybe 2015, I think. And the Arizona documentation, which certainly doesn't mean that it isn't anywhere else, and it probably very much is in other cannabis that people just aren't documenting scientifically. But it's very, very much all around North America and various other places. But yeah, so beet curlytop virus is a huge problem. I have a video on what the symptoms are and what it looks like in cannabis, because it's really important for me that people are able to, at all scales, both commercial and residential and everything in between, if they're able to detect it, know what it is, and know what its vectors are for that matter, then they'll be able to not spread to other people potentially and destroy contaminated plants if they can. And I think that's really important, because the more cannabis cultivators that are aware of this sort of a thing, then I think the better we'll be in general. And then I also mentioned lettuce sclerosis virus, which is a creamy virus. It also has that recombination ability, and it's vectored by the silverleaf whitefly. Beet curlytop virus I didn't mention is vectored by the beet leafhopper, which is very common in North America and abroad. It's the only known vector. With LCV, the silverleaf whitefly is the only known vector, I believe, and it's pretty common in cannabis and other agricultural places. So again, it's one of those viruses that kind of doesn't surprise me, along with beet curlytop virus, because the host range is just so broad. The other thing to consider is that I think for both beet curlytop virus and lettuce sclerosis virus, they can infect other plants that show absolutely no symptoms. And so they can be in like some weedy goosefoot that some beet leafhopper or silverleaf whitefly is feeding on outside your property, show no symptoms at all. And then when it changes seasons, or the plant gets big enough, or the colony grows large enough, it'll just come into your field and wreck your plants, because neither of these viruses are curable conventionally.
Yeah, the other one I was going to ask you about is mosaic virus, because I see quite a lot of mosaic virus as I go, and there seems to be kind of three different common patterning, I guess, with the stuff that I've documented at least.
Yeah, as far as I know, I haven't seen any recent research that shows that tobacco mosaic virus is in cannabis, but I'm happy to be proven wrong or right on that. I can't look at all the literature all of the time. but I do want to say that it wouldn't surprise me at all if that were the case. Because again, like the other two viruses, it's got a massive host range. Um, so
Well,
yeah, I think you said that you've documented it though on kits, right?
well, yeah. So we've sent some stuff off to medicinal genomics. I'm not. I'm not. I haven't gotten anything back yet, but we've sent stuff off to them to try and figure that out. There's a group in Israel that actually did a paper on it, and they documented, wasn't it 12 or 14 different ones? Arabis mosaic, alfalfa mosaic,
Yeah,
cucumber
I think
mosaic.
there's a Hartowitz report in the 1980s.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Hmm.
Yeah,
I'm
and
a
they had
little
documented a bunch of different species in cannabis tissue, at least.
I'm a little bit dubious about about that particular research report. It's very often cited to me when I say what I just
Mhm.
said. And the reason for that is just because it's a little bit old. Some of the virus names and classifications have changed. Some viruses, and this has been a problem in virus taxonomy for since its beginning, because you get this situation where viruses can either co-infect and produce totally different symptoms that you wouldn't expect based on what each one of them are like isolated. So they would count it as a totally different virus when they're not really the same. You also get situations where we find out that like one virus is a strain of another one actually, and a lot of this has happened because of the increase in genomics technology. So I'd like to see just like kind of a follow up to that, because it very well might be true that those viruses do infect cannabis, and I'd really like to see that kind of um, more specifically looked at. But like you say, I'm glad that you were able to send those out. And if you get results in that way, or if you have other information, I'd love to take a look at it and make a point about it, because I'm writing a chapter for a book that will be published by Elsevier sometime this year, hopefully, and it's about cannabis viruses in particular. So I'm really looking forward to getting that kind of information and being as up to date as possible up to this particular 2021 time period.
Yeah, it's definitely. I'm not sure what species of mosaic, but there's definitely a streaking mosaic virus of some type that slowly kills the plant. It makes them slowly curl up and reduce chlorophyll production, and then the leaves just don't grow, and then it just kind of you know stops really growing all that much after a while. I have some pretty advanced pictures of some plants that were flowered out and stuff like that as well, that show it. But yeah.
Speaking of viruses, there's a we mentioned rice root aphid before, and you also mentioned sort of the relatives like Rhopalocyphum nymphae and Rhopalocyphum patty. I think it's another one like the water lily aphids. There's a Rhopalocyphum patty virus that can actually colonize plants and exist in their tissues for like 2 weeks or so, and it infects rice root aphid and a bunch of other aphids and is transmitted by that virus in particular. It could potentially be a control measure, although it doesn't directly kill the aphids themselves. It really screws them up physiologically. So, in combination with other things, I wonder if it could be a potential biocontrol. Oh, nice pictures. Yeah, that definitely looks problematic. Oh, are you talking?
I'm sorry. It starts to deform the leaf growth and makes for much smaller yields and things like that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I
Uh,
have seen it spread in. You can see kind of in a couple of grows, you can kind of see the moms that are definitely had it from a long, long time, or at least it was expressing. And then you see it in other ones where, only maybe the newer growth has it, where maybe they had pruned and not cleaned their pruners right and transferred it. At least that was the theory that I had with how some of it spread, because some of their older plants don't have it, or even those same cuts in other rooms. of the non, majorly infected strains. So, um, just a theory where I've seen it pretty heavily in one or two rooms over others.
I will definitely
And
say.
that's a question I'd love to ask you is for something like this, if you did know you had it and you were pruning it, is the standard keeping, 3 or 4 sets of pruners in a container of rubbing alcohol and then going 1, 2, 3, 4 when you're going through different plants and soaking them for a couple of things? Is that enough to work kill most viruses, or do you need to do something more intensive?
It can definitely work for a lot of viruses, but one of the caveats that people should take away is that it doesn't work for viruses or viroids, I should say, in this case, like the hop latent viroid. You should definitely be using something else besides alcohol because, believe it or not, they can survive it. Or at the very least, they can survive it if it's not like a constant thing. Um, I'm pretty sure is the case. There's some things like I'm trying to remember the product, like Vicron S, I think it might be called, or something like this. I'm blanking on the name. Also bleach. I know that's sort of a contentious thing for a lot of people, considering very understandably that. Now, see, this is an interesting picture, but I'll continue here for the moment.
Sure.
Yeah, so like there are ways that you can sort of disinfect your equipment. Isopropyl or other kinds of alcohol is really helpful for more complex contaminants.
Yeah.
So I've definitely seen like sort of variegation like this before, and in fact, I took a bunch of pictures of it at a different location or a certain location recently. And I think I remember you even showing me these ones too. I'm curious about this honestly, but it could just be a sport mutation. I really don't know, unless these are one of the ones you were sending to get tested.
No, those ones were that particular one is from an older grow.
Interesting.
I have another one I got sent. I'll have to find it. It's in my one of my decks here of one that's actually real clear variegation with the ivory and the like split leaves and stuff like that. It was real pretty. Uh, I'll have to find it. But one of the other things I noticed the last year is with the people growing lots of vegetables with their cannabis is cilantro really seems to be a root aphid magnet.
Oh, I believe it. Yeah, they do love those herbaceous plants for sure. They also really like, off the top of my head, because I just made the video, mountain ash, um, jet bead, flowering quince, any of the prunus genus plants. So your stone fruits, things like that. In fact, those are their primary hosts in Japan and in Eastern Asia. Um, Oh, and like the biggest like kind of herbaceous plant that I see feral and wild all over the place in urban settings as well as rural settings, and even suburban is grasses. They love grasses. Of course, they're called the rice root aphid for a reason. Um, but they definitely appreciate a good rye, definitely a good little grass or plant that's just kind of eking out an existence in the cement cracks. They'll definitely feed on that. And I've worked with a number of people where they're like, I don't know where I got the rice root aphid problem from. They just came out one time. I have a story where I was working with somebody in Los Angeles, and they told me that they got rid of some ivy that was on their walls, and I don't think it wasn't the ivy that it was the host probably, but it might have disturbed some other grasses and other plants. And when they did that, they said they started getting rice root aphid, and they weren't sure what the problem was. Turns out that 10 steps away from their main door, I bent over, plucked a stalk of grass, and on it were tons of rice root aphids just chilling out. So sometimes the enemy is right next door, and people got to look for the signs and symptoms and be vigilant.
And your neighbors too. If somebody's got a ton of spider mites or russet mites or broad mites, you need to maybe even try and help them out a little bit to prevent your own stuff from getting attacked. Um, I've also noticed you had a thing about grape mealybug lately. It seems like that's the third or fourth insect I've heard from the grape and vineyard world attacking cannabis. Is that should we just start assuming that most of the grape pests are going to potentially be an issue for cannabis? Because it seems like there's a new one every year.
It's a good question. Probably not. I would definitely presume that because we don't know very much about the pest sort of like sort of the pest range, I guess you could say for cannabis. Presume that things can probably at least feed on it a little bit. And jumping off of the sort of virus conversation, which I wanted to say first before we kind of switch gears, that I think that the Hardowitz paper did mention cucumber mosaic virus, and that's one that I think might be a ticket for one of the things that you're mentioning, some of the things you're seeing here, or
Yeah.
also possibly another place, because and I'm forgetting why I had that thought, but I had it before, and I remember that, but I don't remember the reasoning behind it. I think it had to do with cucumber mosaic virus getting folded into another viral taxon or something.
Well, you
Um,
also have the whiteflies will actively feed on squash, anything in the squash family and cannabis pretty readily interchangeably.
oh yeah, that's a
So
good point.
the chance of it vectoring is very high, and there's a lot of different mosaic viruses in the cucumber and squash world, and the potential definitely is there.
Um, so yeah, I would say that one of the things that I also like to do is help a lot of people, as many people as possible. Of course, I work as a consultant professionally, but it's also really important for me, like I've already said multiple times, that people get as much info as possible. So I make a lot of this free IPM content for people on my YouTube channel and on various other platforms. You mentioned that I've identified several sort of pests in cannabis. I don't want to sound like I'm tooting my own horn a little bit here. I'm sure I'm not the first person to actually see it myself. Maybe the first person to document it on video in the way that I have, which isn't saying much. But I do think it's really helpful that people know things like buffalo tree hoppers that are out there, even if they're just incidental, because um, like you mentioned, like with the silverleaf whitefly, that whitefly vectors like 180 known plant viruses at least, 180 plus, and like so you don't know, like an insect can just feed on a plant, probe it once, and transmit a virus, even if it can't reproduce on the plant, even if if it's a thrips, for example, it can't, it doesn't matter if it can reproduce or feed for a very long period of time, it can still transmit really easily. So that's just a big biosecurity risk in and of itself. As far as like great pests, though, I think that there are a lot of pests that kind of do well, and aphids are one of them, on woody plants. In fact, the aphid sort of lineage predates flowering plants. So they were kind of in their infancy when plants were only gymnosperms and other sorts of things. And that's when they got a lot of their really good plant immune system and attenuating abilities, or plant immune system blocking abilities, or resilience in that way. And then they kind of, at least some of the theories about them is that they speciated with a bunch of plants as they developed too. But I bring it up because I think some plants, so a lot of pests that go good on vineyards are enjoyers of like woody sort of plants, and cannabis definitely gets woody. So I feel like there's definitely a sort of a ecological overlap there. I would think it's safe to presume some of that is probably still out there, ready to be documented.
Do you have any advice for people here with springtime coming up on advice on what they can do the beginning of the season here? I know I'm often a big fan of nematodes, but and then before that, do you want to tell everybody your consulting service and maybe a little bit about that and how they can reach that if they're interested in have a commercial grow and need help with their IPM plants?
Absolutely. What was your first question again, so I remember it?
Oh, it's fine. I'll ask you that afterwards. Tell us a bit about your consulting company and kind of what you provide there for people.
So Zenthanol Consulting is the name. And I've been working at this for a decade now, which is kind of cool to always think about. It's sort of surreal to think about it, honestly, when I consider my own life history and that kind of a thing. I'm really happy that it's something that I enjoy and that I have enjoyed since I was a kid, which is dealing with bugs and fungi and plants and that kind of a thing. Um, so the services that I provide generally are on-site evaluations and sort of an integrated pest management SOP. And I also have a retainer function for those who need it. I also help with training as well. I'm very passionate about that. And as you can tell from my continuous references to helping people out and making sure people know about IPM biosecurity and best practice and that kind of a thing, that is something that I'm very passionate about. And so training is a really important aspect of IPM. Actually, I should say the facets of that training rather. So crop scouting is a big part of it, but as well as identification of pests and sort of prevention methods, which I think you were asking me about earlier now that I think about it. So being able to sort of prevent things before it happens and being able to identify sort of problems in your planning from various spectra, like IPM isn't just what you do, to spray plants or to apply beneficials, although that's really important and a lot of people don't even know very much about those facets. But it's everything from the location in which you decide to grow your plants to your financial situation, even your resources that you can apply for problem solving. Um, whether you have the equipment that you need to apply things safely or the licenses in order to do that therein. So having that information, which also changes state to state in the United States of America, but also country to country for that matter. So being aware of that is also really important and critical.
And that's something a lot of people don't realize too, is some of the things that they plan on using for cannabis. When you get into some of the more heavy duty stuff, you have to be licensed to purchase a lot of it. So depending
Yeah,
on the state you're in,
yeah,
California being one that's particularly prickly.
yes, definitely. I love and hate it at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. Um, you had oh I, and um, so you also had a thing about lace bugs. I haven't seen too much about lace bugs before. It was a really cool video.
Yeah, thanks. So the Tingidae is the lacebug family, and a lot of people um, aren't familiar with them. They don't get a whole lot of attention, I feel like, which is totally valid. I think they're kind of an incidental pest, if I'm being honest. But I have seen them really colonize cannabis kind of like out of nowhere. So I think if they're kind of host starved or there aren't a whole lot of hosts around, or maybe if there's a ton of hosts around and they're all kind of colonized, you might start to see lace bugs. I think the lace bug that I was seeing in the video that you're referring to on my channel was also shot in somewhere in California, anyways, probably Southern California. And I think the people over there were calling them. They had it's kind of I love it when people kind of invent names for things they've never seen before. In general, I'm a big linguistics and psychology of communications kind of guy. I love that kind of stuff. So people were calling them dino bugs. They're calling them dino bugs. I remember, and that was kind of funny because the etymology for that is like I asked them why they called it that, and they're like, well, they kind of look like hardy, and they're sort of like just walking around with spots. And I'm like, I have no idea. I guess for the hardiness comment, I get it, but everything else besides that doesn't make any sense. But whatever. Um, but yeah, they are kind of like aphids but bigger. They have kind of a pretty design on them. That's why they're called lace bugs, because they have this sort of like exoskeleton that is very intricate and kind of looks like lace. So hence the name.
So do you have what kind of advice do you have for people coming into the springtime for maybe the home grower that's growing their six plants at home? I'm definitely a big fan of nematodes. Is there any others that you recommend kind of for people just getting started and um, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I like to tell people that in integrated pest management, it's not me who came up with this, and it's been expanded upon quite a bit. But some of the sort of like basic I guess you could say like classes of techniques or sort of schools of treatment that are possible can be kind of broken down like 5 or 6 maybe different categories. Big one that people know about, of course, are chemical agents. Most people are familiar with those first, and there's also biocontrol agents as well, secondly. But the big ones that people can work on that I think people don't think about too much and don't consider, which could be a great cost benefit for you, are physical controls. Things like barriers, which I mentioned earlier already, netting and mesh screen and things like that, especially not only commercial, but also residentially. You only, if you do it correctly, you only have to really apply it once, and you just have to maintain it and make sure it doesn't get damaged. And if it does, you seal it or you replace it or you do something like that. The reason why I say this is because you can solve 99% of your problems by simply not letting the thing get to the thing. That's the first rule of any kind of security: personal security, physical security, cyber security, biosecurity. It's called defense in depth. You want to just make sure there's as much of a barrier or difficulty to get to the target um, that you can.
Speaking of which, you were just talking about attack drones. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah,
It's actually
definitely.
pretty cool.
Yeah, so I am a military technology purveyor. I think there's a lot of interesting concepts that often get used in the military. First, of course, there's tons of technologies from like World War II that have become commonplace now, right? Like radio and that kind of a thing. World War I should say. Or the interwar period if we're being pedantic. But that's the thing, is that I like to pay attention to those sorts of things, not only because it was a thing I almost, went towards. I was actually in a military school growing up, but I neglected to choose that route. But I've never stopped being interested in that kind of stuff. Anyways, nowadays, autonomous drones and aerial vehicles that are manned are becoming more common. And I was posting on my Instagram about a sort of a defense package against swarms of drones, because that's already a problem, and it's going to become a major problem for warfighting groups, especially peer-to-peer warfighting groups, like let's say the United States of America and the Republic of, the Federation of Russia, or the People's Republic of China, or something like that. Some of those might be less peer-to-peer than others, depending on how you look at it. But what can you do? Like aircraft carriers. I know this is kind of a weird example, but if you don't know what that is, it's like a big ship with a bunch of aircraft on it, and it's usually part of a carrier group with a bunch of other ships that defend it. But what do you do if you're an admiral on this ship and somebody has launched 500 missiles at your ship, or drones that can just blow up on impact? You only have, like, I don't know, maybe 100 or a couple of hundred missiles for defense. It's not enough. You want, and they're not going to be perfectly accurate. So there's this big problem where, what do you do if you have a huge swarm of things that can damage you, and you can't get them all with all of your conventional munitions? Well, you can use lasers. That's one thing that you can do to shoot them out of the sky. Or you use a less expensive missile, but that's hard to do because drones are cheap and easy to produce in mass and control in mass. And there might be electronic warfare that you can do too. But I've gotten really in the weeds there. But do you see where I'm going with this? Insects operate like this, and there's already technologies that people are using in the Netherlands, like micro aerial vehicles that scan a greenhouse space for targets, and specific targets, by the way, not like any insect or any arthropod that goes in there that it'll attack. And the way that it attacks is not with a laser, but with the physical propellers that it has. So it scans the area, finds a target, and it approaches the target, closes distance, and then uses the propellers to eviscerate it. And then you can just do that anytime you want. You can have it flying around doing a patrol. And I just think that's really innovative. And if people are able to like democratize that technology, if you're using it correctly, if you're using it in a specific area, and you're being responsible with it, that's a great way to replace like chemical agents that are broad spectrum. And I think from an ecological and environmental conscientious perspective, I think that would be way more approachable.
Have you ever played Half-Life?
I know what a manhack is.
Yes, I was just thinking that.
Yes, yes, eviscerators are real life now. I've also played Half-Life Alyx on the Oculus, and that was a really great experience, I have to tell you. I'm not a huge fan of the Oculus and where it's going currently, speaking of VR, but it was a grand experience. And anyone who's interested in VR, just play that game first if you can, and it'll blow 90% of what's out right now out of the water. But I'm hoping that in the future, Valve and other groups become, if that's the baseline sophistication, that'll be amazing. Anyways,
Oh yeah, wholeheartedly approve of that one. That and Beat Saber and VR boxing, man, it keeps me in shape.
there you go, especially in quarantine. I actually originally got my Oculus because I wanted it in case, like, when I go on to do on-site evaluations and I'm in a hotel or I'm in some sort of living space, um, I can use it I can connect to my desktop away from it, which is kind of cool, which is helpful as like a workspace. But also, like, I can play around on the airport, or like while sitting down. I'm not one of those people who want, and you shouldn't be doing it in open daylight, as I'm sure you're aware, right? Like, the HTC has cameras that are, of course, UV sensitive and that kind of a thing, right? Or is it pass through? Is yours pass through?
I have a Vive,
Oh,
so
okay.
I have the little things. But what I do is I'll just tuck one above like the bathroom door in the hotel room, and the other one over like the curtain rod over the window, and I can set up in there, set my laptop up, and
Nice.
then I can be anywhere, and I can get a good workout, and I can like you know still have some kind of like release that's like different. That, and if I have a really bad day, I can just hop on pistol whipped and really feel good after 2 or 3 rounds of that. You're pretty tired.
I definitely got to work out with. I was playing the Star Wars VR. So there's like a 3-part story, at least on the Oculus, and it was on rails, and that's okay. I've played on rails games in arcades and things, and I'm used to it. It's not my preferred sort of game type, but uh, I was pretty impressed, honestly. And like, again, it's way less superior to like Half-Life Alyx and that kind of a thing. But there's this training thing that you can do with the lightsaber. So like, as if you were a Jedi or a Padawan, I should say. And you've got like the training drones and other sorts of things that shoot at you, or they move around, and you have to like deflect it with with your lightsaber, or attack close range while standing still, or like really in a very small space. And so I definitely felt like I got a good workout out of that for sure.
I also like Elite Dangerous, just doing space trucking, doing cargo missions with the VR, and I have the voice thing so I can talk to it and it'll control the ship and all that. It's super super immersive. And then just Google VR, being able to see places that
Oh
I
yeah,
haven't seen, and being able to just be at street view and look around, especially if you have kids and stuff like that for education,
oh
and
yeah.
seeing different places that you maybe can't afford or maybe politically can't ever see. It's a super super cool app that just kind of gives you an experience that's different than anything else. And I've had so many cool people that maybe I've been able to show them where they're from or something like that, and really really gave them a cool experience. But we had a couple of insect questions here. Was broad or russet mites talked about yet? What treatments are good for a home grower? I hear a lot about heat treatments and hot water dunks. Have you spoken about that at all?
No, not, or I definitely have. Not on this podcast, but I definitely have on my YouTube channel, Zenthanol. I also wanted to say that I have used my VR to check out locations that people give me, like clients, for biosecurity. So I can literally be there at like at the address level or something and look around. In some cases, not all cases, but that's been a fantastic experience for me. And it's not perfectly accurate, of course, but it's just one of those things that can be really helpful from a professional perspective. Anyways, moving on. Broad mites. I actually have a recent video about broad mites on cannabis in particular, showing what the damage looks like, because Hemp russet mites and broad mites look very similar damage-wise. They both have a phytotoxic saliva, and that's why. They kind of, and also thrips and other insects can sometimes cause like weird leaf formation and other sorts of things. And because they're also tend to be, a lot of them anyways, vectors for viruses, that's also incredibly confusing from cannabis because we don't know what the virome of cannabis is right now. So is it the toxic saliva? Is it the virus? What's going on? It's a little confusing right now. But broad mites, one way you can easily tell the broad mite from the russet mite, even though their damage is sort of similar, is under a microscope or under a really powerful hand lens. I can see them if I know what I'm looking for. I can see broad mites and russet mites, and you might be able to too, people who are listening or watching. So don't let somebody tell you that you can't. But what I would advise people do first, especially if they already see the damage, which you can see in the footage on the video, which is really helpful, is that you can put under a microscope maybe 60 times or something like this and check the damage. Broad mites are sort of a oblate spheroid. They're sort of football shaped. And females are kind of rotund or kind of like sort of larger, kind of around the midsection. And males have like a very sort of gaunt, kind of tapered like back end, but they move pretty fast for their size. They're pretty active usually, so that's one way you can tell them. And they also have eggs that have small little tubercles that look like white dots in a very regular sort of pattern on their eggs. So that's one way you can tell them really easily. And I can't see that on with my hand lens. I can only see that on a microscope.
Don't broad mites kidnap their girlfriends too?
So some broad mites have a really actually not that all unique behavior where males will tardigrades actually have this too, where females will stay what's called phaerate, and that's when a female, or not just a female, but that's when an organism sort of like molts or changes its exoskeleton or something, but it stays inside of the like shed skin, kind of like as like a second layer almost, and that for like protection or for dormancy or something like this. So the males will seek out females when they're like developing, like they're basically in sort of like a pupa-like form, sort of intermediate form. The males will find them through a chemical sense, pick them up with their special thread feet, and then they'll carry them around, to another location, possibly even another plant even. So that's one way you can also tell them different. Is that they have this sort, you might see this like T-shaped sort of bipartite organism walking around where like part of it's upraised, and that's the female. And so what will happen is that the female will stay sometimes inside the case even after developing, and then the male will guard the female until it comes out, and then the male will mate immediately, and then the female will be able to produce more males or females, because broad mites are haplodiploid like a lot of arthropods, meaning that unfertilized eggs become male and fertilized eggs become female. So females also will mate with their progeny. So you only need one female to get a colony going, and they reproduce really quickly. Hemp russet mite, on the other hand, is sort of a worm-like body. It's only got four, although I don't expect people to see it on a microscope, they've only got two pairs of legs, so like four of them. And they kind of have this like snake-shaped body, sort of worm-like. Vermiform is described as. And they
I like to say they look like a pizza slice.
yeah, definitely. They have like a triangular kind of cone, like kind of like those bugle chips, I think of oftentimes, because they also are like ridged, the chips are, and sort of the mite is also kind of like that, the idiosoma kind of body part. Um, and their eggs are different. So if you're not seeing those tubercles on the eggs, then you're probably seeing hemp russet mite. And if you're seeing the very obvious russet mite body form that most russet mites have, then you will definitely have hemp russet mite. It's also a specialist. Broad mite is called Polyphagotarsonemus latus. That means many eater Tarsonemus, which is the family Tarsonemidae. So they feed on all kinds of things, and they'll even travel on silverleaf whitefly, specifically wax. they're attracted to the wax and they'll latch onto their legs and other body parts for like hours at a time in order to get to a new host. So it kind of, you can get like a 3-part whammy with a silverleaf whitefly. You might be unlucky and get a silverleaf whitefly that's proliferous for the lead sclerosis virus and has a broad mite on it. Those are russet mites though, yeah. Yeah, so that's, so russet mice, as you can see, have sort of a sort of worm-like body that kind of tapers to a point. And they can also be kind of active. They can kind of get going, but they sort of waddle. They're not nearly as quick or as active as broad mites are. And the hemp russet mite is a specialist. It only feeds on cannabis, as far as we understand it. And what do I want to say about that as well?
You can see it's about the same size as some of the immature trichomes. Give people a size, reference of size.
Oh yeah, and you can also see some of the eggs there too. They're like circular. Yeah, so that's really a good image for that.
Yeah, I just pulled this off of Google real quick just to show what you're talking about.
Definitely a good idea. So yeah, so most russet mites are actually not a pest. There are other russet mites that are pests of other plants too. But most russet mites that we know of, which is not a very well studied group to be honest, especially until recently, but usually they don't cause huge problems for their hosts. They're usually very kind of innocuous. But some of them cause galls or blisters on the plant host, which is why they're sometimes called gall mites or rust mites or things like this. But except for those versions, most russet mites are hanging out, not doing anything. So the pest species that we know of are kind of aberrant in that way.
We had another person in Czech. I'm currently battering spider mites using Dr. Zymes and DE. Dr. Zymes and DE is probably not going to do a great job of getting rid of your spider mites. You'll have a much better, at least I've found, much better response rate with some, depending on your temperature, Persimilis or Californicus, something like that, depending on which mite is going to work out better for your temperature range. Persimilis for most people for indoor, and then Californicus for more outdoor. But maybe you have a different opinion on that. But I think that's they seem, as long as you hit them, on a regular schedule, they seem to just do a really good job of wiping them out pretty well.
I would agree with that. I think I'll echo the sentiment. I love to advocate for Phytosilius persimilis for spider mite control. But I do have a video on my channel that goes, actually I have a whole list of videos about spider mites in general. There's also the clover mite, which doesn't spin webs usually, and or at all, I think, and is also a spider mite that people can sometimes get, especially if you have clover or grasses in your area, which most people do. But spider mites, yeah, Persimilis mites are great. Californicus mites are great. The other sort of type 3 mites like Swirsky and Cucumeris, I wouldn't rely on. They might nibble on an egg or a nymph here or there, or a larva, I should say, but they won't really be a huge, I guess you could say, hard counter. They're kind of a soft counter, whereas Persimilis and Californicus are more of a hard counter.
What is your opinion on the what are they called, the spider mite destroyers, the ladybird? Because
Oh
I've
yeah,
tried them a couple of times, and I've only had really good luck with them in warmer stuff. When I was using them with the Californicus and hotter house greenhouses, they seem to tolerate the heat pretty well, compared to a lot of the other options. I don't know if you had any other feedback on that.
Yeah, Sithoris punctillum is the spider mite lady beetle, and I'm a fan of them as well. I just feel like the economy of scale is so much higher for the Persimilis mites. In my experience, it's just usually easier and simpler for people to use them, but they're definitely a valid option. Um, in addition to that, there's also the spider mite fly Feltiella acarasuga, which I have a video about as well on my YouTube channel. And I like them too because of how voracious the larvae is. I was actually just watching that video recently. I sometimes watch my own videos to get an impression of where I've been, how I can do better, and also whether or not it's kind of a relevant thing to talk more about. And I remember that the larvae of the spider mite fly were, at least in one laboratory study anyways, much more voracious than the Persimilis were, I think. I think it was Persimilis that they were compared to. But yeah, it becomes a question of how much do you want to over egg the pudding and how much of a layered system do you want. I'm an advocate for holistic, multi-tiered sort of perspectives on your IPM strategy. It's good to have multiple layers attacking multiple life stages of whatever you're dealing with, and if possible, to maintain it prophylactically and sustain a population of whatever that biocontrol is on or in or around where you need it to be. And in the case of spider mite predators and other like carnivores, that can be very difficult or impossible to do without prey. Whereas things like the type 3 predatory mites are more generalists, like cucumbers and Swirsky, and they'll go after things like thrips and silverleaf whitefly and other whiteflies. And they'll go over and that might even eat some moth eggs while they're at it sometimes. So I'm a big fan of using generalists, but specialists, when kind of hyper targeted, can be very useful.
That's something about the Persimilis a lot of people forget about when they're talking about it is Persimilis almost exclusively feeds on two-spotted spider mites and not much else. It will occasionally feed on other stuff, but that's its primary food. That's its number one thing it's looking for. So that's another reason why they are such a good thing to use. We had another question on, where is it here? One second. Congrats to Gavin Bradley. Says, Steve, I got a job at university because of your videos. Thank you so much. Congrats, buddy. We had someone else say, there was another bug question here. What do you have any predictions for anything that you saw a lot last year? I know 2 years ago I saw a ton of septoria. Last year was a little bit drier, but we saw a lot more botrytis last year than anything else. Do you have any kind of magic ball predictions for what we'll see a lot of this year, or maybe something that we'll see more of documented?
Definitely. So one big one that occurs to me when you say that are the viruses we just talked about, and also hemp phytoplasmas. So phytoplasmas are bacteria that colonize the phloem channel or the sap channels of plants, and they're known in North America, India, China, or those sort of biogeographic regions. In other words, kind of everywhere, and they sort of colonize a bunch of different kinds of plants, kind of like the tobacco mosaic virus we discussed. So for that reason, it's kind of unsurprising that they also infect cannabis. And they've been documented for a while now, I think since like at least the sort of 2010s, in cannabis in North America, for example. So those are something that I'm kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop on. Also, the B. curly top and litter sclerosis viruses, I think, are going to get worse before they get better. And they're going to become not cryptic before they become, before that happens. So I think that that'll probably happen sooner rather than later. I really hope that that doesn't happen, but I feel like it will. Especially when I consider how easy it was for hop latent viroid to kind of hit all the various places it did. In addition to that, there's also one other pest that's a big problem in the East Coast right now. They'll probably already know what I'm talking about. It's a spotted lanternfly. Huge problem in Pennsylvania and various other states in the East Coast. And it does feed on cannabis. It does come from, sort of Central and Eastern and Southeast Asian areas. And so does cannabis for that matter. It's thought it might have speciated there, in fact, from a co-ancestor with hops. So if that's the case, and it does feed on cannabis, and it's been documented in Chinese research. So I don't, and I have people who have shown me pictures as well. So it's definitely confirmed. Whether or not it'll be a huge problem will totally entirely depend on whether it's able to colonize effectively other parts of North America in the next few years, because we're desperately working on biocontrol agents and other sorts of control measures for viticulture and other sorts of agriculture, like especially in orchards. So I feel like if we're, depending on how things go, we might be able to have a few things kind of ready and waiting and sort of more established than they already are. They're also really large, so they're kind of conspicuous. You can see them, but they can exsanguinate a plant. If you get too many on a tree or other kind of plant, they can literally feed all the phloem sap and eat their body weight multiple times per day, potentially. At least a lot of these hemipterans can. And not a lot of things like to eat it because it's kind of bitter. It has alkaloids in its body, and particularly when it feeds on Chinese sumac, which is also really common as an invasive sort of weedy plant that's choking out native vegetation in North America and other places. So, in combination with those vectors, I think it could be a really huge problem.
What kind of alkaloids? If they're psychedelic alkaloids, I think this problem might solve itself pretty quickly.
Oh,
But I'm
I
just kidding.
wish. Maybe if you eat enough of them, maybe it'll be a deliriant. But yeah, they're very bitter, whatever they are, and things don't like to eat them. A lot of them don't. But I've seen pictures of like mantids and other things taking a bite. But currently, we're looking at there are some nymph parasitoid wasps, and so I should say wasps that attack the nymphal stage, but they're kind of. And I talked with Mark Hoddle, who's a University of Riverside extension agent researcher for these biocontrols on Crop Talk Media several months ago at this point. It was a very illuminating conversation. I even got to ask him about cannabis and whether he thought it would be a huge problem. And he seemed to think that it may or may not be, if I remember correctly, but I just presume that it might be. And I also want to say that I do have to get going in a few minutes. I think you said 90 minutes, so I did
Oh
plan
yeah,
for
I'm sorry.
that. Oh, that's totally okay. But if we have some lightning round questions, I'm happy to get to them.
Oh, okay. Let's see if there's any others here. Oh, there was one other question this guy had that was pretty good. Do you have, how do you introduce beneficial pests to fight off bad pests without unbalancing your local ecosystem? I think that was a pretty good question.
It's a very good question. It's something I'm passionate about because as much as I like broad spectrum predators and generalists and even like Blueberry bassiana that feeds on tons of different insects, I'm also ecologically concerned with the ramifications of their poor mismanagement in the same way that I would be for chemical agents. So one of the ways that you can do that is to kind of grow your plants in a way that's cordoned off from the rest of the environment if possible, either indoor or in some other sort of way that sort of corrals them, and make sure that you're applying them responsibly. Some level of naturalization may be possible or has already happened in some cases for biocontrols, and to a certain degree you can't really control that, and it's a question of sort of human interest over others. Biocontrol companies and sectaries, and I won't make any friends by saying this sort of a thing, they do like to sort of promulgate this idea that they are uh, partners with nature, or in some ways they are sort of, it's a natural control. And to some degree it is, but to some degree it's not when they're invasive or exotic.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up the show. Why don't you tell everybody again about your consulting company and how to find out more information about your YouTube and your Instagram and your other awesome places that you put content out.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to it again soon. So, if you are interested in some help with integrated pest management at any scale, really, but I do tend to focus on commercial scale applications, you can find me on zenthanol.com. You can also find me on my YouTube channel, Zenthanol, as well as on Instagram at SyncAngel, also on Twitter at SyncAngel for that matter. And I'm very excited to work with people in the cannabis space and also other agricultural crops as well. And I'm very happy to help you out with your problems if you have them, especially identification work.
All right. Thanks for coming on. I got one last question for you here at the end. What do you think ladybugs are actually good for? Because I haven't. What have you found something that they actually work pretty well for?
And so, ending on a complex question, I like it. I'll say it this way. Most of the time, a lot of people don't know that some of the lady beetles that are found, like Harmonio axyrotis, the harlequin lady beetle, are actually alien invasives that will feed on native lady beetles, transmit a pathogen to them, and generally be a problem for the natural ecosystem. They even bite people, so they're just not great. But there are other lady beetle species that are good. And the main thing that they're good at, the generalist ones that mostly people associate with aphids, they can be very good at that. The California lady beetle, the seven spot lady beetle, and other ones. Um, but there are other lady beetles. There's a Delphasis catalinae that feeds on the silverleaf whitefly. There's the Staphylococcus punctillum we mentioned, the spider mite lady beetle, and there's also Cryptolaemus montroseri, which is the mealybug destroyer that feeds on mealybugs and also a few other things too, but mainly those. So lady beetles, as a family, the Coccinellidae have fed on tons of different organisms, including plants and fungi for that matter.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for coming on, man. It's always a pleasure to have you on, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk to us about all the awesome insect knowledge that you have, man.
Oh, well, I'm very happy to do so. Anytime.
Appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Cheers.
Alrighty. That was a really good episode, everybody, and you guys can find more episodes over at the Growing with Fishes podcast and on the SoundCloud, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and all the different places. And you can find out if you want more information on aquaponic cannabis, you can find that over at apmjclass.com. And if you need nutrients, you can find that over at apmjnewts.com, nutes.com. For those, and you can get the link to the description. All right. Thanks a lot, and we'll catch you guys again next week.